So in the previous videos, I whetted your appetite as far as a career in the computer networking industry by sort of painting out what is a computer network, what are the components of it, what do we use it for, some of the basic technologies of routing and switching and security and collaboration. What are they? How do they fit into a computer network? So at this point, you might be wondering, great, this sounds like something I want to get involved in. I'd like to learn more about it so eventually I can work in this industry. But what kind of jobs are there? How do I work in a computer network? So I'd like to talk about some of the more common job roles that you'll see listed and what they entail. So when it comes to information technology, certainly there's a lot of different roles, right? There's software programmers that write the software, write the code for what we do. There's hardware engineers who are specializing in memory or monitors or hard disk drives. And then there's engineers that work in networking technology, which typically fall into one of about 4 different categories: the network architect, the network engineer, the network administrator, and then also technical support or help desk. So what makes these different? Before I go on any further, I want to make sure that you understand that these job descriptions are very fluid. In other words, what a person doing one of these jobs will actually do depends on the business or the company they work for. For example, if you work for a really small company, if let's say you work for a company of 100 people or less, and you're in charge of working on the network. Well, whether you have the title of a network administrator or a network architect, if you're the only person in charge of the network, that means the job role doesn't really matter. You're going to be doing everything on the network, from designing that network to implementing it, to monitoring it, to troubleshooting it. Where these job roles really vary or start getting segmented from each other is more when we talk about really large corporate networks. What I usually tell people is the larger that a network is, the more devices connected to it, the more complex it is, the more opportunity there is for people to specialize on that network. For example, if you want to specialize just in security, as an example, well, you're probably not going to go to some company that has 50 or 75 employees and say, well, I'd like to work on your network, but just work in security. Their network isn't big enough to justify hiring someone to just work on that aspect of it. Or if you say, well, what I want to do is I just want to design a network. I'm not really interested in actually plugging in cables, lugging a router from one rack over to the other and screwing it in, getting into something and changing the way it operates. I want to figure out a network from scratch based on certain needs and requirements and design that. Well, if you're talking about working for a large company that's growing, that's merging with other partners or acquisitions, yes, there are probably opportunities for that kind of a job role. But if you're working for a smaller to mid-size opportunity where the network isn't changing that much, then they're more in need of someone to just monitor the network and fix it when it breaks, that's not really going to be a place where you can do that type of job. So let's start by taking a look at network engineers and network architects. So network architects and engineers, a lot of times these job roles blend into each other. So you'd really have to take a look at the job description to find out, what does this company mean when they say they want a network architect or a network engineer? So generally, network architects and engineers are hired to work on larger networks. Networks are changing over time, they are growing, they need to be scalable. Not necessarily a network that's just fixed, that hasn't changed in the last 5 years. They don't need a network architect or network engineer. So network architects in specific really focus on network design and conception. So a classic job description of a network architect would be someone that a company would want to bring in. Usually they're not full-time employees. Usually network architects, like it says here, are often hired as consultants rather than W-2 employees. Now you might be wondering, well then why would I ever want to be a network architect? Because they're at the top of the food chain. As far as networking careers are concerned, network architects get paid the most. So the highest salaries go towards network architects. So even though you're working a lot of times, not always, But a lot of times as a contractor, you're making the big bucks. You're making a lot of money. But clearly to get to that position, you have to have a lot of knowledge. You have to have a lot of experience. You have to have a lot of certifications under your belt to prove that you're capable of doing this job. So what is the job? Well, network architect's job, like it says here, is typically network design and conception. So if a company is saying, look, we're building a whole new building, a whole new campus, and we need to design a network to go in there. We need to bring someone in who can listen to our needs and our requirements, who will ask us questions like, all right, how many people do you foresee needing in this building immediately? And how do you see the growth of your employees happening over the next 6 months, year, 5 years? How do you see this network as being segmented? In other words, are you going to have certain security requirements where certain parts of the network can or cannot talk to other parts of the network? What type of information do you see riding on this network? Is it going to be pure data? Is it just going to be for web browsing and email? Or are you going to, at some point, need to layer voice and video on top of this network as well? How much redundancy do you want in this network? Clearly, the more redundancy you want, which translates to more cables, more interfaces, more routers, and more switches, means the more money you have to pay. So there's a balance there between a lot of redundancy and a lot of money versus no redundancy and a less expensive network. So the network architect is going to ask all these types of questions to sort of visualize and come up with what the network will look like, to be able to plan it out, draw it out, and provide a project plan or a blueprint to the customer that they can implement. Now, in that type of scenario, at that point, the network architect's job is probably done. They can collect their paycheck, they can walk away, and now the network engineer will actually be in charge of implementing that network. So, for example, the actual purchasing of the products. The network engineer might be the one who has to do the price matching of, well, do I purchase something from this Cisco partner or that Cisco partner? Is this particular model of router or switch what I want, or do I need a different model of router or switch? What blades or modules do I need to purchase for this switch? Where do I go to purchase my my cabling, and how much cabling do I purchase? Okay, I need to drill holes in the walls to start running this cabling, and how much length of cabling do I need? Where do I buy my racks, and how do I implement my racks so I can rack and stack all this stuff? Okay, how do I, so the network engineer will actually be implementing this and actually then get onto the routers and switches and start configuring them, turning on the protocols, turning on the features, turning on the stuff that needs to actually make this plan that the network architect came up with into a reality. I saw online some interesting quotes about what differentiates a network engineer from a network architect. And so I just wanted to share some of these with you. One person said, a network engineer has PuTTY on his desktop. A network architect has Visio on his desktop. Now, if you're not familiar with those, PuTTY is the program you use to actually get into a router or a switch. So if you want to get into a router or switch so you can start typing away and sending it commands, PuTTY is an example of a program you would use to do that. Whereas Visio is a program you use to draw things. So the network architect who's going to come up with a blueprint, a drawing, they're going to use Visio to do that. Another thing that I read, architects typically know the ins and outs of network appliance models, features, and prices, and can help a business figure out the best plan to lay out their network. The network engineer is the person who actually implements it. And one other thing I read, I thought this one was kind of funny. The general rule in tech, an architect usually implies a higher pay grade than an engineer. Architects get to sit in rooms and think and draw on whiteboards. Engineers are those lowly guys who actually go implement things, deal with the problems, and get their hands dirty. So that's sort of a general difference between network architects and network engineers. So architect, you can think of design. Engineer, you can think of implement. Now, does that mean that if you get a job as a network engineer, you're not going to be able to design anything? By no means. Like I said, it all depends on the company. Some companies don't really have the need to contract out for, $100,000 for 6 months a network architect. They've got network engineers who work for them who are very smart people who can design networks themselves. So the line is very gray and fuzzy behind the duties here. But network architect typically means design. A network engineer could be design, sometimes is design, but network engineer is more hands-on implementation of things. Now, chances are if you're getting into networking at the base level, you're not going to start right off as a network engineer or a network architect. You're going to start as something else. And that's going to be the network administrator. Or maybe the next job role I'll get into. So a network administrator, first of all, I want to make sure you're aware of something. Many companies these days, the network administrator not only is in charge of monitoring the network, cabling things up, troubleshooting the network-related stuff, but a lot of times that same person will be expected to know the servers as well. Now, once again, a lot of this depends on the size of the company. If you go to a really large corporation, they might be big enough where they have the job roles segmented. They might have the server guys, and it's their job to deal with the servers, to do stuff like this. Is there space available on the server for users? Is there enough memory and processing power for all the users we need? Capacity planning. Do we need several more servers because we're starting to scale and the servers we have are getting maxed out? They're starting to run really slow. They're starting to be limited on the resources, and we need to get more. Server backup plans. How do I back up my data? If a server fails, I want to make sure that all the information that was on that server is stored somewhere else in a way that users can get to it quickly and easily. Hopefully, it's seamless, where the users don't even know that a server failed. They don't even know that they're now being directed to a backup server. Well, how do you make that happen? Creation and storage of user credentials, files, and directories. So larger corporations, they might have the server people that do just this. And when it comes to networking, the server people, they know what a network interface card is, and they can plug a cable into it. But at that point, their knowledge is done. They don't know how to manage or monitor the switches or the routers or anything else. That's not their job. That's the network administrator's job. So in some companies, a network administrator will truly deal just with the network. But in a lot of companies these days, the job roles blend. So I'm just warning you here that as you start pursuing jobs as network administrators, you might see a lot of network administrator jobs have some also requirements that server stuff, like Windows Server or Unix or Linux or something like that. So just be forewarned that that is a trend that's moving forward. Now, as far as the actual network portion of the job, what does a network administrator do? Well, they install and configure new equipment. So a lot of times when the network engineer or the network architect orders a new router or a new switch, it will be the network admin who will have to unpack it from the box, blow all the styrofoam off of it, plug it in, use the screwdrivers to connect it to the rack, make sure there's plenty of space around it for the heat to dissipate, turn it on, and then do the initial configuration. So a lot of times the network administrator won't be in charge necessarily of determining what features should run on that box. So routers and switches, when you're talking about network operating software, have a lot of different features you can turn on and turn off, just depending on what you want that thing to do. So most of the time it's the network engineer or the network architect's job to figure out what features should be running on that box. So they will provide to the network admin, they'll say, here's the features I want you to turn on, here's how I want it to operate, and then the network admin will be in charge of actually logging into that router switch and knowing the command line well enough that they can access that feature, turn it on, and tweak it in such a way that it will work to the specifications that were given to them. Cabling equipment, certainly, or recabling if cabling goes down or cabling goes bad. And implement change requests and implement upgrades. So a lot of times an existing network will change over time. Maybe not physically, maybe the actual hardware and software of a network will remain static for several months or maybe a couple of years, but during that period of time, there might be requests that come in to turn on new features, modify the existing functionality of existing features, tweak with the routing protocols, basically make the existing network operate in a more efficient, optimized way. And so the network administrator will be the job to do that, to get into the devices and do that. Once again, the person who comes up with the decision of this is the feature we need changed, this is how we need the network optimized, that is typically the network engineer's job, not the network administrator's job. And then we also have the role of technical support, which is a job role. Technical support typically is phone support. So you would be, for example, if you were working at Cisco Systems in the role of technical support, you'd have a cube, you'd be on a phone most of the day answering calls either from internal customers or external customers who are having problems with their network. And your job would be to research networking protocols by reading documents, reading websites, maybe logging on to routers and switches remotely and trying stuff out and playing with it so that you knew how the stuff worked well enough that when someone was describing a problem to you verbally, you could diagnose and help troubleshoot that and help fix their problem. So a technical support role typically does not have hands-on experience of hands-on installation of equipment. There's some technical support people that have actually never touched a router or a switch, but they know the internal workings of the router or switch so well. They know all the details of how these protocols work, how the timers work, what trigger causes what thing to happen, that when you describe a problem that the router switch is having, they don't have to ever have touched it. They can tell you exactly what's going on and how to fix that. So a technical support role from a networking perspective is a great place to start your career in computer networking. It builds great foundational knowledge of software and network operating systems. So, who is right for the job? What type of personality characteristics do you need to have to do this type of thing? Number one, you got to be highly organized. If you go home and you look at your house and it's just a complete hurricane, there's boxes everywhere, there's junk piled up to the ceiling, you can barely make your way through the rooms, you might want to give a second thought as to whether or not you should work in the computer networking industry. So you have to be highly organized, be able to prioritize things really well. You should enjoy learning new things. This is not a static career, okay? So like a lawyer where there's new laws coming out all the time and lawyers have to keep up to date on the new laws, same thing with computer networking. There's new features, there's new hardware, there's new software that comes out all the time, and you have to be willing to stay up to date on that. Now, some networking job roles have the luxury that during times of relative stability, when there's not a lot going on in the network, you have the luxury of sitting in your cube and reading periodicals, researching some of this latest stuff, so on the job while you're getting paid, you can learn. Other networking admins and engineers don't have that luxury. There's so much stuff going on all the time in the network, one project after the other, that they have to take their time after work or on the weekends to read up and study and just keep fresh on the latest developments. But you have to enjoy learning new things. Willing to work off hours. This is also frequently a responsibility. Remember, this network is expected to be up 24/7. And very few network admins or engineers have the luxury of working for a company that completely shuts down at 5 or 6 o'clock, where the network is not used at all after that point in time. Even if the users and the employees go home at 5 or 6 o'clock, it's still expected that the internal websites, the internal email, all of that will still be functional, so someone working from home at midnight or someone trying to access your website from across the world can get to it. So if that stuff goes down, you have to be willing to troubleshoot that at any hour of the day. Critical thinker for troubleshooting. So you should be able to listen to a problem or have a problem described to you and not completely freak out and not just lose track and not know even where to start. So troubleshooting skills are a requirement here. You have to be able to hear a problem and in your head sort of rule out everything that would not contribute to that problem and sort of zoom in on the potential causes of that problem. Zoom in on, okay, of all those potential causes, which one is the easiest for me to troubleshoot and knock out really quickly, and take a logical, progressive, methodical approach to troubleshooting. That needs to be a skill that you have. Works well with others. Yeah, so you're going to be working with other network admins, and you're going to be working with other IT staff. You're going to be dealing with people who are sometimes going to be kind of angry because they were in the middle of a stock transaction and going to buy a new Lamborghini when the network went down. Or they were trying to have a Skype session with their girlfriend when the network went down, and they're not going to be too happy about that. So you have to be able to deal nicely with people who might be having a bad day because the network isn't working the way they expected it to work. And the ability to sit in front of a computer monitor for extended periods of time. Other than when you're installing new equipment, most of the job of a network admin or a network engineer involves being on a computer, getting into stuff remotely, researching documents, trying out simulations. There's not a lot of opportunity to get up and walk around unless something's critically going bad and you got to run into that lab real fast before something blows up, or you got to install some new equipment. Most of the time, it's sitting at your desk looking at your computer. So like I mentioned, if you are starting your career in computer networking, don't even bother looking at network engineer or network architect positions. You're going to want to be looking at either help desk positions or network admin positions. So if you're thinking about network admins, the next logical question you might have is, what kind of pay can I expect for a network admin? Now this next slide I'm going to show you, I went to 4 different websites and got some average pay ranges for network administrators. This is just for the United States, okay? So if you're watching this in a country other than the US, you'll have to utilize your own local versions of Google or whatever to figure out what the local pay rate is in your particular part of the world. But here in the United States, payscale.com, and I'll make this larger right here, says that a network admin goes anywhere from $37,000 to $78,000 a year. A lot of that depends on what portion of the United States you're in. Clearly, if you are a network admin working in New York City, you're going to get the upper end of that pay scale. Whereas if you're a network admin working in some small town in Kansas, you're probably going to get the lower end of that pay scale. Glassdoor.com says it's about $63,584 nationally. Salary1.com raised that to about $70,951. And itcareerfinder.com gives the average range from $71,000 to $105,000. So you can see there's quite a bit of range there, but I would say it's reasonably safe to assume that you can expect a job as a network administrator for around $55,000 on up. So if you're currently making in the 20s and 30s, that's going to be quite a large pay increase for you. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about computer networking job specialties and what these specialties are and what types of things you would do with the network if you are operating as one of these specialists.